Hey friends, Mindy here. I have a little technique video for you today. In my recent video about kind of shopping your stash, I was talking about a technique that you can do with watercolor and this particular stamp for Hope's Door, and someone asked if I could post a tutorial about what I meant by that, because what I was talking about doing was stamping this, embossing it, and then using the lines that are kind of created from the embossing to kind of drop watercolor down into this to color this image. But I thought it would be maybe helpful to talk a little bit about watercolor in general. I'm not a watercolorist. In general, I tend to gravitate more toward acrylic paints and those kinds of mediums, but I just thought I would show a couple of things, because knowing how your stuff is going to react will kind of dictate sort of how you use it. So if you know how, like if you know the result that you're looking for, having a couple of these techniques in mind might help. Also, the substrate that you're using is going to make a difference. So I have two papers here. I have a cold press watercolor paper and I have a Bristol Vellum Smooth paper. And they're each going to react different. And the reason I'm doing it on both of these is because I want to point out the fact that if you're doing this in your Bible, every Bible is going to react differently as well. If you have the spiral bound illustrated faith Bible, it does not take watercolor in the same way as some other Bibles do. It just really, because the paper isn't coated. So there's just kind of a lot of factors to kind of consider. I don't want that to deter you from trying it, because it's still going to turn out and be fine and look beautiful and whatever, but just kind of having an idea of how you want your watercolors to react might help you kind of get the look that you're achieving. So there are a few, and again, I am not an expert on watercoloring, so I'm just kind of sharing some knowledge that I have gained through the years. I have my cold press watercolor on the left. I have my Vellum Smooth on the right. And I'm going to go through just three kind of techniques really quick. I already have some watercolor over here off to the side that I've already sprayed with water to activate the color. That just helps you get better saturation. But the first technique is a dry brush technique. Now, this is a lot of times used especially in like acrylic painting and whatever, because it gives you that more defined kind of stroke, but you can still do it with watercolor. So I have a dry paintbrush, and I have some paint over here that, like I said, has already gotten water in it. And so what I'm going to do is just pick up as much water, as much as I can. And you can kind of see, I hope you can see this okay, that when you do that, especially on this cold press watercolor paper, you can get really those sort of strict marks. And I'm using a completely dry brush, and this just gives you certain techniques. Now you can come back in with water and change that kind of that look, but you can kind of see the difference already. Okay, so that is just picking up paint, as much paint as my little brush can hold, given the fact that my brush is actually dry. So that is on those two papers. I hope that shows up okay on the camera. And then the next one I want to do is a wet technique to dry. So I'm going to I'm actually going to use this paintbrush. Also, your paintbrush matters. So paintbrushes that are designed like for watercolor in particular, they're going to hold more water in them, and you're going to get better results, especially like if you're using something that's like a mop brush or whatever. This is just an 11, size 11. It doesn't really matter. I've used all kinds of brushes with watercolor, especially if you're just going to be dropping color into something where you're not actually like trying to paint a scene or something. If you want to follow a really good watercolorist, and she actually does Bible journaling as well, I would recommend Sandy Allnock. She does a lot of Bible journaling. And she's a fine artist, but she gives so much information. So I'm just going to throw her out there because she does Bible journaling as well. But the next technique is wet to dry. So my paper is going to be dry, but I'm going to get my brush wet. And I'm going to go in, and I think I'm just going to use this same purple just so you can kind of see. And it's not just even the technique of how you're applying it, but it's kind of what it does when it dries. So we're just going to apply this here. This is, again, wet to dry. So I'm going to get some more water on my brush here. And it's not super saturated in my brush, but I'm able to pick up the color a little bit easier. You can kind of see how it blends a little bit easier. You can kind of see also the difference between a watercolor paper and a Vellum Smooth. This is a paper that I actually use all the time. I love this particular paper. because you can do a lot of technique with it, in particular with mixed media type things. And so I use this paper all the time, but watercolor paper is obviously designed to pool and do different things with it. So I'm just going to let this sit. You can kind of see this is, you know, the immediate color, and then I just kind of faded it out, but you can kind of see the difference already between those two. And now I want to do a wet on wet technique. So I'm going to start with just wetting this paper. And this is kind of the idea of what I was saying in that video about how you can kind of drop color in and it's going to do different things. So I'm just getting this pretty wet here, and then I'm going to go in and grab some color, and now I can just kind of drop it in, but I'm going to go through that same sort of motion that I did up here just so you can kind of see the difference. So now I'm going to get that wet over here and just kind of understand too that wherever the wet paper or the wet watercolor hits the dry paper, it's going to kind of pool and do different things, which is it's kind of works in your favor if you're wanting to do, in particular, a watercolor technique where you want some shading. Having it kind of pool up in those areas will just give you some different effects. So again, I'm just going to go in here. I think I need a little bit more water. This doesn't take water quite as well, but I'm just going to kind of go in here, and you can kind of see this one. This is the one thing when you're going in with a lot of water, you have to be a little bit careful on like this vellum smooth paper, because it will start to sort of pill the paper up just a little bit if you kind of continue to scrub. So you can kind of see what all of this watercolor is doing here on this watercolor paper. So I'm going to now dry this because I want you to be able to see kind of what's happening on the actual paper. So I'm just going to hit this with my heat tool real quick. Okay, so it's mostly dry. It's not 100%, but you can kind of see that what happens as it's drying, especially on this, you can kind of see it just a little bit better, is you get these edges where like part of it is dry and then part of it's wet. You're going to get these kind of lines. If you want to avoid that altogether, then just make sure where you're dropping in more color, like if you need to go pick up more color or whatever, just make sure that where you're dropping it in is wet, and it will blend. So I just wanted to kind of show, if you did want to maybe, like this is already pretty much dry, but you can add over this some of the other techniques. So you can come in now that this is dry. Okay, this is not dry. It's not dry well enough to do this, but you can come in once this is dry with some wet color, and it's going to react a little bit, but it's not going to do the same thing. So you can still come in and drop color back in there. And so if you wanted to, for instance, make it darker, I'm just going to go back into that same purple color. And this again is not 100% dry, but you can see that you can kind of add some shading, and it's not going to reactivate. It's still going to kind of keep that edge, but it's going to sort of feather into it a little bit. So it just really kind of depends on the technique or the look that you're wanting, but this is a good way to add if you want to add some dimension or some shading just naturally. You can kind of just drop in some color, let it dry, or dry it with a heat tool, and then come back in even with the same color. And then I'm just going to actually grab a little bit of this blue, and you can kind of see, you can sort of drop it in and do things with it. You can move it around. There's a lot that you can do, and it's not going to necessarily move that color that's underneath there because it's dry now, if that makes sense. So I don't know if this is really helpful information or not, and I don't really know if I'm explaining it very well, but you can kind of see. So here where you have the dry brush technique, you have a really heavy concentration of color. It's going to kind of skim over, especially the more textured that your paper is. You kind of get those dry, scratchy, like brush marks. And it even happens here on this. This is actually smooth paper. So watercolor paper is more textured. This is actually a smooth paper, but you can still see those kind of sketchy lines on there. And if you're getting this effect and you don't want that effect, it's possible that you just need to add a little bit of water to what you're doing. So I will even show you can kind of, come in here and just sort of move it around and I'm only going to go this far. And then what's going to happen is you're going to kind of end up with that same line, like when it dries, like how you get down here from just adding the water. Those are all effects that if you're, depending on the look that you're trying to achieve, you can accomplish that way. So, and then you can see on, you know, the wet to dry, it, you get a really nice blending of the color. The color doesn't puddle, but it does, it's going to stay exactly where you put it. It's not going to spread out. Whereas here, because this whole area was wet, it kind of faded out and it bloomed and kind of did its own thing. And this is a really interesting way to get some different effects where you don't have to overwork anything. You can just have it wet, drop some color in, and then let it do what it's going to do. And that's kind of the fun aspect of watercolor, in my opinion. So I don't know if this was too much information or helpful at all, honestly. I hope it was helpful. But just in terms of the technique that I want to show with the stamping, this is what we're going to be doing. So we're going to stamp and emboss that. And what that's going to do is kind of create a raised edge so that the water sort of pools in different places within the image. You don't want to like totally saturate the paper, but it's going to create barrier. So one of the good things about that is when you're watercoloring, if you have something that's really detailed, if you wanted to do like this stamp, for instance, and you wanted to do all the different sections in different colors, if you haven't embossed that, it's going to kind of keep all the color in that one little section instead of bleeding into other areas, which you can do if, you know, you're watercoloring next to another color. So it's going to help that. But also if you just end up going through and say, like, we just saturate this whole image and then just kind of drop different colors in there and just get that really kind of ethereal watercolor effect, it's still going to add, because of the heat embossing and the embossing powder, it's still going to cause it to kind of pool and puddle, and it will actually naturally give it some definition and some shading and just, you know, some variation of color. So we're going to do that next, but I just thought it would be helpful to just kind of talk about watercolor in general just for a second, and then we'll go ahead and I will stamp this on some paper and we'll do that wet on wet technique and see what happens. Okay, so moving on to the actual technique, which was the whole reason behind this video, I am going to be stamping this beautiful image from the Hope's Door stamp set. This is an old stamp set from By the Will for God, but this technique works with anything you want to stamp. I am stamping on the Bristol Vellum Smooth paper. I like it because it's a nice bright white, and I am using VersaFine in Vintage Sepia. I just felt like the black would be too harsh. The VersaFine Onyx Black ink is a great stamping ink. It stays wet and long enough that you can add the embossing powder over the top of it. But for me, for today, I'm just using the Vintage Sepia. I just feel like it's going to match the color scheme just a little bit better. So I'm adding my clear embossing powder here. This is, I believe, from Wow. And then I'm just going to shake off the excess, and then I'm going to hit this with my heat tool. And you'll see as when you're melting this, it kind of changes colors. That's kind of how you know that you have got this melted, especially when you're using like a clear embossing powder. And you can kind of see, I'm trying to show you how it's raised just a little bit, but it's kind of hard to pick up on camera. So I am using the watercolor dot card from By the Will for God that comes with the Hope or Hints and Whispers devotional kit. And I'm using a little bit of packaging, and I'm just pulling up the watercolor and putting it here on this packaging to kind of create a little palette. You could certainly use a glass mat. You could use a nonstick craft sheet. You could use a whole bunch of different things. I oftentimes will use an acrylic block. Today I'm just using this packaging because it was sitting right there. But I want to just pull these colors off of that watercolor paper and onto a palette so that because the colors are so concentrated, you just want to make sure that you're not pulling straight from that card, because it'll just kind of push that paint right down into that watercolor paper. So just pulling those colors off that I think I'm going to be using. And then I started with putting some water down with my brush, and then I just decided to spray it with my Tim Holtz sprayer, and then I'm going to kind of smooth everything back out again with my watercolor brush here. And then I'm just pulling up a little bit of paint and just dropping it in just really roughly into these little sections, and it's going to kind of pool in those areas because of that embossing powder. So kind of going around the outside with, you know, a more brown color, adding a little bit of darker area, letting the paints sort of mix and do their thing as they want to. That's the beautiful thing about watercolor. That's why I love this particular technique, is you really don't have to be a watercolorist to be able to achieve something that I think looks nice. So you can see I'm just adding some of this brighter yellow color here in the middle of this door. I wanted to kind of make it look like light was kind of shining through there. And then around the outside where there are some vines, I'm just dropping in some green. And so I have water is completely surrounding the image, not just in the image. I want the ink, I want the paint, excuse me, to flow outside of this image. It's just going to give it that really soft look that I'm after. I'm adding a little bit of that kind of reddish color to the pots down at the bottom, just to kind of give a little bit of interest. And then I'm going to kind of work this color around the outside. So you'll be able to see where the edge of the water, like the water line is, because the watercolor is not going to move past that line. So you can kind of see where it's all going to stop and it's going to bloom. And one thing about this technique is I do like to let it air dry. You certainly can heat it with your heat tool. I just like to let it air dry. It just does fun things. So you can kind of see how everything, now that this is dry, this is a couple hours later, I had set this to the side and gone off and done some other things. But now I want to create a darker brown, and I'm just doing that by adding all of those colors together. They're all going to make brown together. And then I'm just dropping it in where the like naturally shaded parts of the stamped image are. So where they look like they have a little bit more shading, I'm just dropping this in. Now, I did not re-wet the image. I just picked up with my wet brush, I picked up the paint, and I'm just dropping it now back into those images. And it's going to stay more where I want it to, because that paper is no longer wet. So now I had a wet on wet technique. Now I'm doing a wet on dry technique. And that's just going to give me a more concentration of color. It's going to help me do some shading and just give a little bit more dimension and stuff to these colors. So this is how these kind of techniques sort of work together. So I'm adding just a little bit more of that kind of magenta-ish color down there at the bottom in those pots. And then I want to really brighten up these doors again. So I'm going to add that yellow color. I don't have that dot color card in front of me to tell you the names of them, but just adding a little bit more color there in the center. And again, I'm doing a wet brush on dry paper, and it's just going to give some more dimension and interest. I'm going to hold it up so you can kind of see just a little bit better that, and I will trim this image down some when I actually use it in my Bible page. But this was kind of the inspiration for this particular picture, this paper was. So if you liked this video, if you felt like it was helpful at all, I really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and until next time, bye.